I never thought my life would become the kind of story people whisper about at family dinners or share online as a cautionary tale. My name is Natalie, I'm 27 years old, and up until just a few weeks ago, my life was painfully ordinary. I was a kindergarten teacher at Sunshine Elementary School, living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny one-bedroom apartment that I decorated with secondhand furniture and a jungle of thrift store plants. My days were filled with finger paints, alphabet songs, playground duty, and parent-teacher conferences. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and I found joy in small things. Like the way my students' faces lit up when they sounded out a new word or when they proudly showed me a crayon drawing of their family. To most people, I probably looked like someone with limited ambitions, a young woman destined to live a quiet life with modest means. But what people didn't see was the deep bond I had with the two people who shaped me more than anyone else, my grandparents, Elizabeth and Harold. While my parents were physically present but emotionally absent, my grandparents were my anchors. Every weekend and every summer since I was 5, I stayed with them at their cozy 4-bedroom house, a place that felt more like home than the one I technically grew up in. Their house wasn't flashy. They had money, though I didn't truly realize how much until much later, but they lived simply. Grandpa Harold spent mornings in the vegetable garden, teaching me how to grow tomatoes, zucchini, and corn with patience and pride. Grandma Elizabeth spent afternoons in the kitchen showing me how to bake cookies from scratch, how to sew on a button, how to slow down and savor the little things. Those lessons didn't just fill my weekends, they shaped the way I saw the world. While my classmates dreamed of sports cars, designer brands, and big city jobs, I dreamed of stability, kindness, and making a difference. That's why I became a kindergarten teacher. My grandparents didn't just accept that choice, they celebrated it. While my parents rolled their eyes at my unprofitable career, my grandparents came to every school play my students put on, clapping like I had won an Oscar. My parents, on the other hand, were cut from a different cloth. My father, Richard, was obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder, putting in 60-hour work weeks, chasing promotions and titles like they were trophies. My mother, Diane, was just as busy, but her focus was social status, networking at galas, maintaining appearances in high society circles, and ensuring her name was whispered at the right dinner parties. Family dinners were rare, and when they happened, my parents spent more time staring at their phones or discussing business connections than actually engaging with me. I was an accessory to their image, not a daughter to be nurtured. In those lonely moments, my grandparents filled the void. They attended every soccer game my parents missed, every school play where I looked out into the crowd and saw their proud smiles instead of my parents' distracted faces. When I graduated college, they were the first to hug me, tears in their eyes while my parents clapped politely from a distance. They didn't just pay for my education, they encouraged me to follow my heart. Looking back, I can see how different their philosophy of life was compared to my parents'. My grandparents always told me, money is just a tool, Natalie, not a measure of your worth. Use it to build something meaningful, not to impress people who don't matter. Those words stuck with me more than any lecture, more than any school lesson. To them, character and compassion were the real inheritance they hoped to pass down. At the time, I didn't fully understand how radical that belief was, especially in contrast to my father. He always believed wealth should buy comfort, status, and control. He saw his parents' frugality as a form of deprivation, almost like they were punishing him by not handing him luxury on a silver platter. What my grandparents considered character building, he considered stinginess. This difference in values created a rift that only deepened over time, but I wasn't focused on that. My life was small, predictable, and ordinary. My apartment rent took up most of my paycheck. My car was a decade old, with a stubborn rattle that no mechanic seemed able to fix. I grocery shopped with coupons, checked out library books instead of buying them, and found joy in weekend hikes through the state park. I lived simply, but I was content. If you had told me back then that within weeks my entire world would be turned upside down, that I would inherit $26 million and become the target of my own family's rage and greed, I would have laughed. That kind of drama didn't belong to people like me. It belonged in movies, novels, or gossip columns, not in the quiet life of a kindergarten teacher. But life doesn't ask if you're ready before it drops a storm on your doorstep. And my storm was about to begin. My grandparents, Elizabeth and Harold Alexander, were not born into wealth. In fact, their story began with almost nothing, just a dream, a work ethic forged in hardship, and a single delivery truck. In the early 1970s, they started a small logistics company in their garage. Grandpa drove shipments himself while Grandma handled the books on the kitchen table. Slowly, through long hours and sacrifices, they built Alexander Logistics into a regional powerhouse. By the time I was born, the company had grown into a fleet of 200 trucks, 5 warehouses, and a reputation for reliability and integrity. What always amazed me was how little they changed despite their success. Grandpa Harold drove the same pickup truck for 20 years, Grandma Elizabeth clipped coupons and never left the house without her bargain bag where she kept discount flyers. They didn't flaunt their wealth. Their home, though spacious, was comfortable rather than grandiose. Their friends weren't wealthy investors or country club members, they were neighbors, employees, and people they trusted. Money is just a tool, Grandpa used to say. It can build walls to keep people out, or it can build bridges to bring people together. The choice is yours. That philosophy shaped everything about their lives. They reinvested profits back into the company, offered profit sharing to employees, and created retirement plans that were unusually generous for a mid-sized business. Their workers didn't just respect them, they loved them. To this day, some of the employees from the early years still referred to my grandparents as Mr. Harold and Ms. Elizabeth with genuine affection, almost like extended family. But not everyone saw their humility as wisdom. My father, Richard, hated it. To him, wealth meant luxury, status, and the ability to prove yourself better than others. He didn't understand why his parents lived like peasants, as he once cruelly put it, when they had millions sitting in the bank. He wanted the mansion, the vacation homes, the fast cars, the high-profile social circles. He wanted the life he thought he was owed. That clash of values caused tension for decades. My father was the only son, and he always believed Alexander Logistics was his birthright. When he graduated college, he expected a cushy executive role, maybe even the top seat. But my grandparents refused. They believed in meritocracy, not nepotism. They told him he would have to start from the ground up, just like every other employee. My father didn't take that well. I remember overhearing one of their arguments during a family dinner when I was still a child. My father raised his voice, demanding to know why he should have to earn a place in a company he was destined to inherit anyway. Grandpa Harold stayed calm, but his words cut like steel. You'll inherit nothing if you don't understand what it took to build it. Respect is earned, not given. Instead of rising to the challenge, my father stormed out. Within months, he had taken a corporate job at another logistics firm, choosing ambition over family ties. From that point forward, his relationship with my grandparents was fractured. Holidays became tense, phone calls were rare. He visited less and less except when he needed something, usually money. For my mother, Diane, my grandparents' lifestyle was equally baffling. She saw their frugality as an embarrassment. Why clip coupons when you had millions? Why drive an old truck when you could buy a luxury SUV? Why host simple family dinners when you could throw lavish parties? To her, their humility was not admirable but humiliating. I think deep down, she resented that they never fully embraced her into their world. The irony was that while my parents pulled away, I pulled closer. I adored my grandparents' quiet strength and consistency. Their modest home, with its vegetable garden and shelves of family photo albums, felt safer than my parents' glass and granite house where appearances mattered more than affection. That difference, my closeness with my grandparents versus my parents' distance, fueled even more resentment. My father would occasionally accuse me of being the favorite, which I never understood at the time. I didn't know then that he already feared what would one day become true, that his parents might leave me more than they left him. Over the years, the rift grew wider. My father would come around only when he won. Did financial favors, requests for loans, pleas for investment in his ventures, or demands for luxury purchases he thought he deserved. My grandparents kept records of it all, every visit that revolved around money rather than love, every time he dismissed their values as old-fashioned. Meanwhile, my bond with them deepened. We had standing Sunday dinners. I brought them small gifts, homemade cookies, photo frames, little crafts my students made for me. To me, these were just gestures of love. To my grandparents, they were reminders of what family should look like. They knew I wasn't there for handouts or status. I was there because I wanted to be. Looking back now, I realize my grandparents were deliberate. They had seen through their own son's entitlement long ago. They recognized that wealth can either be a curse or a blessing depending on who inherits it. Quietly, without saying anything, they had been preparing me, not for money, but for responsibility. To my parents, wealth was power. To my grandparents, wealth was stewardship. And in the middle of that tug of war, I was unknowingly becoming the chosen heir of not just their fortune, but their values. This difference in perspective between their humility and my father's greed was a time bomb waiting to explode. And when it finally did, it would shatter my family into pieces. 6 weeks ago, my world collapsed with a single phone call. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, grading my students' spelling tests when my phone buzzed. On the other end was a police officer whose voice carried the kind of weight you never forget. He told me my grandparents had been in a car accident. A drunk driver had blown through a red light, hitting them head-on. They died instantly. My heart stopped. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the phone. The officer tried to soften the blow by telling me they hadn't suffered, but those words barely registered. All I could think was, they were gone. The two people who had been my true parents, my constant support system, my safe place, they were gone in an instant. The days that followed blurred into numbness. I moved through them like a ghost, making arrangements I barely remembered. At the funeral, I felt as if I were trapped in someone else's nightmare. The church was filled with faces I hadn't seen in years. Faces that had been absent during my grandparents' life, but suddenly appeared the moment death had struck. My parents, Richard and Diane, took control of the funeral arrangements not out of love, but out of obsession with appearances. I watched as they argued with the funeral director, not about how to honor my grandparents' memory, but about costs and presentation. My father demanded the executive package, while my mother fretted over flower arrangements that matched her designer outfit more than my grandmother's tastes. My brother Jason flew in from California, strutting through the church lobby with his sunglasses still on indoors, scrolling through his phone during the service. Aunt Pam cried so dramatically it almost looked rehearsed, until I noticed the tears dried up the second no one was watching. Uncle Steve, her husband, stayed silent as always, hovering near walls like a shadow, his eyes darting away whenever I caught them. None of them had visited my grandparents in years. They hadn't called, hadn't checked in, hadn't cared. And yet here they were, posturing as the grieving family, putting on a performance for whoever might be paying attention. It made me sick. As I sat in the front pew, clutching the folded program with trembling hands, I felt utterly alone. My grandparents. Aunts were the ones who had held my hand through every school play, every heartbreak, every graduation. They were the ones who had shown up when no one else had, and now, at their funeral, I was surrounded not by love, but by vultures circling a carcass. When the service ended, people filed past me, offering hollow condolences. They lived such a full life, someone said. They're in a better place now, another murmured. Their words felt like static, meaningless against the enormity of my loss. What I wanted was my grandparents' laughter, their hugs, their steady presence. What I got was empty platitudes. My parents, on the other hand, wasted no time shifting focus. At the reception afterward, I overheard them whispering to relatives about the estate and what happens next. Their tone wasn't one of grief, but of calculation, as if the funeral was just a formality before the real event, the division of assets. I remember standing by the refreshment table when I caught my mother eyeing my grandparents' jewelry with open interest. She leaned close to Aunt Pam and said, "Elizabeth always promised I'd get the pearls." Aunt Pam smirked, countering with, "She told me I'd inherit the silverware set." They weren't mourning, they were dividing spoils. That was the moment it hit me with brutal clarity. Their grief wasn't for my grandparents' lives, it was for their lost opportunity to extract more while they were alive. Now, all they cared about was what was left behind. The hypocrisy was suffocating. These were the same people who had dismissed my grandparents' simple lifestyle, who had called them stingy, old-fashioned, and out of touch. Yet suddenly, they wrapped themselves in black clothing, playing the part of dutiful family members, all while their eyes gleamed at the thought of millions. I couldn't even bring myself to enter my grandparents' house after the funeral. The thought of walking through those empty rooms without their laughter, without their warmth, was unbearable. I went back to my apartment, shut the door, and collapsed onto my couch, sobbing until I had no tears left. It should have been a time of mourning, of shared grief, of family unity. Instead, it became the opening act of a far darker play, one in which masks would fall, true colors would be revealed, and I would discover just how far my family was willing to go for money. At the funeral, I thought I had already lost everything. Little did I know, the real loss was still to come. Not of life, but of family, loyalty, and trust. 2 weeks after the funeral, just as I was beginning to numb myself to the silence of life without my grandparents, the phone rang. It was Matthew Goldstein, their longtime attorney. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words cut through me. "Natalie, it's time for the reading of the will. Please come to my office tomorrow. Your immediate family has also been notified." My stomach dropped. I had never thought much about wills or inheritances. My grandparents lived simply. I assumed there might be some money, perhaps their home, maybe a sentimental keepsake. But the thought of sitting in a room with my parents, brother, aunt, and uncle, people who had already shown more greed than grief, filled me with dread. The morning of the meeting dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood. I dressed in a plain black dress and clutched the umbrella my grandmother had once insisted I keep in my car for emergencies. This felt like an emergency. When I arrived at Goldstein Legal, a stately converted Victorian house downtown, I was greeted by Matthew himself, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. He had been both attorney and friend to my grandparents for over 30 years. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Natalie," he said sincerely. "Your grandparents were extraordinary people. I'll miss our chess games and Elizabeth's lemon bars." His emotion felt genuine, and for a moment I felt less alone. But that moment ended the instant the glass door swung open behind me. My father marched in first, checking his expensive watch impatiently. My mother followed, her designer handbag gleaming under the lights. Jason stumbled in next, sunglasses still perched cockily on his head despite the rain. Aunt Pam arrived loudly, already complaining on her phone about some perceived slight from her country club friends, with Uncle Steve trailing quietly behind her. "Well, let's get this over with," my father snapped. "Some of us have businesses to run." The tension was palpable as Matthew led us into the conference room. We settled around a large oak table. My father sat at the head as though claiming authority by sheer posture. My mother positioned herself beside him, Jason slouched with his phone in hand, Aunt Pam practically vibrating with restless energy, and Uncle Steve as silent as ever. I chose a seat near Matthew, feeling like I might need an ally. Matthew adjusted his glasses and opened a leather portfolio. "Before I begin, I want to clarify that Elizabeth and Harold were of completely sound mind when they updated this will last year. They underwent thorough evaluations and their intentions were explicit." My father scoffed. "Just read it, Matt. We know how this goes. Dad built the business. I'm his son. Standard inheritance procedure." Ignoring him, Matthew began. For several minutes, he recited legal language, revocations of prior wills, formal declarations, executor appointments. My family shifted impatiently, waiting for what mattered most. Finally, he reached the heart of it. "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including all cash assets, approximately $8 million, our investment portfolio valued at $12 million, all real estate holdings, including our primary residence valued at $5 million, and our 25% stake in Alexander Logistics valued at $1 million to our beloved granddaughter, Natalie Grace Foster." The room went silent. I froze, sure I had misheard. $26 million? All of it. To me? Then chaos erupted. My father shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "Let me see that!" He snatched the will from Matthew's hands, his eyes darting frantically over the words. "This is ridiculous, impossible!" My mother's voice sharpened. $26 million to a kindergarten teacher? She doesn't have the first clue how to manage that kind of money. It should be ours. Jason slammed his hand on the table. "What about me? I'm family too. I need startup capital for my business ventures." Aunt Pam turned scarlet. "What did you do, Natalie? How did you manipulate them into this?" I sat there in stunned silence, my mind reeling. I hadn't known my grandparents were worth that much. They had lived so modestly, so humbly. To think that every Sunday dinner, every trip to the garden, every lesson in the kitchen had been with people who quietly built a fortune, yet never flaunted it, shook me to my core. Matthew calmly retrieved the will from my father's grip. "Please take your seats. There is more." He pressed a button on a remote, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. My breath caught. There they were, my grandparents sitting side by side on their living room sofa, alive again for one last time. "If you are watching this," Grandpa began, "it means we have passed on. We want to explain our decisions directly to prevent misunderstandings." Grandma continued, her voice steady but firm. "Richard, Pam, we love you as our children, but we've gone. And deeply disappointed by the values you've embraced. You've treated us not as parents to cherish, but as resources to exploit. We've watched you prioritize wealth, appearances, and status over family, kindness, and integrity." They went on, detailing decades of behavior, missed holidays, unpaid loans, constant demands for more, dismissive comments about their lifestyle. Then Grandpa's voice softened as he spoke my name. "Natalie has been different. She visited us not to ask for money, but because she cared. She chose a career helping children, not chasing profit. She has demonstrated the values we believe in: hard work, humility, compassion. We trust her to be a good steward of what we've built." By the time the video ended, I was fighting back tears. It felt like they were speaking across time, reaching out to shield me even in death. My father, however, erupted. "This is garbage. They were senile. We'll contest this. No judge will uphold it." Matthew remained calm. They anticipated that. Multiple doctors certified their competence. Every decision is well documented. Contesting will be difficult and expensive and unlikely to succeed. My mother's tone shifted to syrupy sweetness. "Natalie, darling, you know this isn't right. This money belongs to the family. You'll share it with us, won't you?" Jason sneered. "There's nothing to think about. It should be divided equally, or Dad should manage it." I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight. The people surrounding me weren't mourning relatives. They were predators who had just seen their prey slip away. As I clutched the envelope Matthew handed me, filled with documents, keys, and financial contacts, I realized my grandparents' gift was both a blessing and a curse. They had given me their life's work, their legacy, but also painted a target on my back. That day in the lawyer's office was the moment masks came off. It was no longer family versus tragedy. It was me versus them. And the battle was only just beginning. After the will reading, I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. That evening, as I sat in my old sedan clutching the thick envelope of documents Matthew had handed me, my phone buzzed. A text from my father appeared on the screen. "Come to our house tonight at 6. We'll sort this out as a family." It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. And I knew instinctively that refusing would only escalate things further. Their house loomed in front of me as I pulled into the driveway. A sprawling 5,000 square foot showpiece of granite and glass. It was built less to be lived in than to be displayed, like a trophy. I parked beside their luxury cars and took a deep breath. My hands shook as I grabbed the envelope and stepped inside. They were waiting for me in the formal living room, a space rarely used except when my mother wanted to impress her social circle. My father stood near the fireplace, a tumbler of scotch in hand, radiating authority. My mother perched on the edge of an expensive designer chair, her expression a mix of calculation and false sympathy. Jason sprawled across the sofa, phone in hand, smirking. Aunt Pam paced like a caged animal, while Uncle Steve stood silently near the window, gazing out as if he wished he were anywhere else. "Sit down, Natalie," my father ordered. His voice was calm but sharp, like the beginning of a storm. I sat in a chair near the door, instinctively choosing a position with an escape route. "Let's be reasonable about this," he began, shifting into his polished business negotiation tone. "Your grandparents clearly weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. That's what we're here to fix," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sweetheart, managing wealth is complicated. Your father has the experience to handle it properly. You're a teacher. This isn't your world. But if you sign everything over to him, you'll still get a nice portion." "Enough?" A memory flashed into my mind. My grandfather's voice when I was 8 years old, standing on a playground after another child had tried to take my toy. "No one can take your dignity unless you give it away. Know what's right and hold firm." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "I'm not signing," I said firmly, rising to my feet. "I'm sorry you feel this way, but I have to respect what Grandma and Grandpa wanted." My mother gasped, launching into a tirade about ingratitude. Aunt Pam sobbed dramatically. Jason muttered insults under his breath, but it was my father's reaction that cut deepest. "Then get out of my house," he snarled. "You're no longer welcome here." I hesitated. "I live in my own apartment," I reminded him. He laughed coldly. "The apartment we co-signed for because your salary couldn't qualify? Check your lease, Natalie. We own that building through one of our companies. Consider your lease terminated." The words hit me like a punch. They weren't just disowning me. They were making me homeless. "You have 30 minutes to pack essential items," my mother said coldly, glancing at her watch. "The locks will be changed tomorrow." Jason smirked. "Better hurry, sis. Those millions won't keep you warm tonight." I stood frozen, my mind spinning. In a single evening, I had gained everything and lost everything. I had millions in assets, but no family, no home, no safety net. I packed my bags in silence while my father watched like a guard. Every item I grabbed felt like proof that their love had been conditional all along. At the door, with my bags slung over my shoulders, I turned for one last look. "You might have money now," my mother said coldly, "but family is forever. You'll realize what you've thrown away." I met her eyes, my voice steady. I'm not the one throwing away family. You are." With that, I walked out into the night, the door slamming shut behind me. Morning came with a gnawing emptiness. My phone buzzed nonstop, missed calls, angry texts, threats from my father and Jason, manipulative pleas from my mother. "Be reasonable," one read. Another said, "You have 24 hours to reconsider before we file suit." Jason's message was the worst. "Enjoy the big empty house while you can, not for long." It didn't sound like bluster. It sounded like a warning. I forwarded the text to Matthew, who replied almost immediately. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't open the door to anyone else." True to his word, Matthew arrived half an hour later with coffee in hand. He sat me down at the kitchen table where my grandparents and I had shared countless Sunday dinners. His calm presence steadied me. "Your family has already contacted 3 attorneys about contesting the will," he said. "But your grandparents anticipated this. They prepared extensive documentation to protect you, and there's more." He slid a property deed across the table. I blinked. "What's this?" "Your grandmother purchased a small cottage outside town 5 years ago. It's in a separate trust, in your name only. Richard doesn't know about it. You'll never be without a home, no matter what they try." Relief washed over me. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt like I had a safety net. My grandparents hadn't just left me money. They had left me protection. Just then, a knock sounded at the back door. I froze, fear tightening my chest, but Matthew smiled. That would be Carlos. I opened the door to find a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, kind eyes, and a respectful posture. "Miss Natalie," he said warmly, "I'm so sorry about your grandparents. They were wonderful people. They asked me to look after you if anything ever happened." Carlos had been the estate manager and handyman for over 15 years. He lived in the guest house on... Late that night, as I sat at the dining table flipping through my grandmother's journals, my phone buzzed with a new text message from Jason. "Hope you're enjoying Grandma and Grandpa's house while you can. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Dad, Mom, Aunt Pam, Uncle Steve, and I are coming to collect what rightfully belongs to us. Better not try to stop us, or things will get ugly." The words chilled me. This wasn't a bluff. It was a threat. I showed the message to Matthew, who frowned deeply. "They're escalating. We'll need to be ready. Fortunately, your grandparents anticipated this exact scenario." "Of course they did," I whispered. It was becoming clear to me just how far ahead my grandparents had thought. They hadn't just left me money, they had left me a roadmap for survival. Matthew immediately began making phone calls. His tone clipped and professional. He didn't explain everything, but I heard words like evidence, documentation, and witnesses. By the time he hung up, his expression had shifted from worry to determination. "Tomorrow morning we won't be alone," he assured me. "Your grandparents made sure of that. They wanted to guarantee that when this day came, and they knew it would, you'd have people to stand beside you. Not just me, not just Carlos, but a network." The thought gave me a flicker of courage, but fear still gnawed at me. My parents and brother weren't just entitled, they were ruthless. They'd already made me homeless once. What would they do when they arrived in person, demanding control? As if sensing my unease, Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Your grandmother always said you had more strength than you realize. Tomorrow you'll prove her right." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me tense. I kept replaying Jason's text in my mind. "Better not try to stop us, or things will get ugly." He had always been for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt ready. Not because I was fearless, but because I wasn't alone. "Open it," Matthew said calmly to Carlos. "Let them in." The moment had come. The gathering storm had finally reached my doorstep. The pounding on the front door reverberated through the house like a warning drum. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Matthew gave Carlos a small nod. Calmly, Carlos turned the handle and opened the door. My father stood on the threshold, his jaw set in stone, flanked by my mother, Jason, Aunt Pam, and Uncle Steve. Their faces carried a mix of anger, entitlement, and smug certainty, as if they already owned everything inside. "Where is Natalie?" my father demanded, pushing past Carlos without waiting for an invitation. "This is family business." I stood in the living room, Matthew by my side. "I'm right here." They froze for a moment, surprised to see not just me, but a room full of people. Rosa with her laptop open, George with a folder of documents, Dorothy standing tall, and even Judge Henderson, a longtime family friend my grandparents had arranged to be present, seated calmly with folded hands. Police Chief Maria Williams followed close behind, her badge discreetly visible at her hip dot. My mother's eyes narrowed. "What is this? You brought outsiders into a private matter?" "No," I said evenly. "I brought the people who truly knew and respected Grandma and Grandpa, people who can speak to their wishes. Unlike you," Jason scoffed. "This is pathetic. You think these people change anything? That money is ours. You can either hand it over or deal with the consequences." Before I could respond, Rosa spoke up, her voice sharp. "Actually, Jason, I have records of every so-called business venture you pitched to your grandparents. Every dollar you asked for, every unpaid loan they refused because they said." Carlos added quietly, "Your last visit after the funeral is already on file. The thefts, the jewelry, the electronics, it's all there." My parents' bravado faltered. Jason muttered something under his breath, but the confidence had drained from his voice. Aunt Pam crossed her arms, trembling with indignation she couldn't back up. Uncle Steve stared at the floor, silent as ever. Matthew stepped forward, handing each of them a sealed envelope. "Inside, you'll find the evidence we've compiled: emails, texts, financial records, video footage. If you choose to contest the will, all of this becomes public record. I strongly suggest you reconsider." My father ripped open his envelope, his hands shaking. As he scanned the documents, his face grew pale. My mother peeked at hers, and I saw her expression collapse into dread. Jason opened his reluctantly, muttering curses as he flipped through screenshots of his drunken threats and reckless demands. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. "You think you can scare us?" My father finally spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't have to scare you," I replied. "Like, Grandma and Grandpa already made their decision. They trusted me, not you, and they left behind everything I need to protect that decision." The silence that followed was deafening. My family, who had always spoken over me, dismissed me, belittled me, suddenly had nothing left to say. The truth had cornered them. Judge Henderson broke the silence. "This matter is settled. The Alexanders' wishes were clear. Richard, Diane, Pamela, you need to accept that." One by one, they faltered. Uncle Steve was the first to murmur, "Pam, we should go." Jason threw his envelope onto the table with a glare, muttering, "This isn't over." My mother clutched her handbag like a lifeline, whispering to my father, and my father, once so commanding, so sure of his power, looked smaller than I had ever seen him, defeated. "This is not over," he growled, though even he sounded like he no longer believed it. But Judge Henderson shook his head. "Actually, Richard, it is." As they filed out, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, I felt a strange emptiness. I had won, but the cost was final. My family was gone, not by death, but by choice, by greed, by their inability to love without strings attached. Dorothy touched my arm gently. "Elizabeth and Harold would be proud of you, Natalie, not because you fought them, but because you stood for what's right." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to peace. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, silence settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The tension that had filled the air just moments before evaporated, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. My family had retreated, beaten not by me alone, but by the weight of truth, evidence, and the allies my grandparents had wisely gathered. And yet, as I stood in the living room surrounded by their journals, documents, and loyal friends, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty. Yes, I had secured the inheritance. Yes, I had defended my grandparents' wishes. Yes, I had finally silenced the voices that had belittled me my entire life. But the cost was steep. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had chosen money over me. My father's ultimatum echoed in my head: sign the papers or be disowned. He hadn't been bluffing. I was no longer his daughter, not in his eyes. Dorothy must have sensed my turmoil because she pressed a warm cup of tea into my hands. "They showed who they are," she said softly. "Your grandparents saw it long ago. That's why they chose you." I nodded, but the ache in my chest didn't ease. For years, a small part of me had hoped my parents might one day change, that they'd see me not as a disappointment, but as someone worthy of love. That hope was gone now, shattered like the glass my father had slammed on the table the night he disowned me. As I sat there, Judge Henderson approached and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Natalie, victories like this rarely feel good in the moment. You protected their legacy with dignity, not malice. That's what they wanted." He was right. My grandparents hadn't raised me to seek revenge, but to stand my ground with integrity. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't begged, I hadn't stooped to their level. I had simply said no, backed by the truth my grandparents had left behind. Still, the weight of loneliness pressed on me. I thought back to childhood birthdays when my parents forgot to show up, to graduations where their seats sat empty, to holidays where they were too busy networking to care. And yet, I had still held on to a thin thread of hope that one day things might be different. That thread was cut now, forever. The others must have sensed my emptiness. Rosa closed her laptop and came to sit beside me. "You know," she said gently, "your grandparents didn't just leave you money, they left you us, people who loved them and love you for who you are. That's family, too." Her words pierced the fog of grief, reminding me of something my grandmother had always said. Family is not just blood, Natalie, it's the people who choose to stand beside you. Looking around the room, I realized she was right. Dorothy, who had cared for the house like it was her own. Carlos, who had guarded the property even after my grandparents were gone. Rosa, who had been their partner in business and now offered to mentor me. Matthew, who had stood like a shield between me and my parents' greed. These were the people my grandparents trusted. These were the people they had chosen for me. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Maybe I hadn't lost everything, maybe I'd simply lost what was never real to begin with, the illusion of a family that had never truly been mine. As Dorothy began serving fresh coffee and pastries as if to cleanse the house of lingering bitterness, I felt a subtle shift inside me. The worst was behind me. The fight was over. And while I hadn't walked away with reconciliation or forgiveness, I had walked away with something just as valuable, the freedom to live without their chains of control and the strength to carry forward my grandparents' true legacy. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't the last time my parents or Jason would try to worm their way back into my life, dangling guilt, threats, or false apologies. But next time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. I had boundaries now, I had allies, and I had my grandparents' values to guide me. As I looked out the window, watching their cars vanish down the long driveway, I realized the truth. I had gained millions, yes, but what mattered more was that I had gained clarity. And in losing my family, I had finally discovered who they really were. 6 months passed in a blur, yet every day carried a sense of transition, of shedding an old skin and learning how to live inside a new one. The first weeks were the hardest. My family's threats still echoed in voicemails, lawyers' letters trickled in before fizzling out, and I battled waves of doubt about whether I was strong enough to handle the enormous responsibility my grandparents had placed on my shoulders. But with the steady guidance of Matthew, the quiet support of Carlos and Dorothy, and the business mentorship of Rosa, I slowly began to find my footing. The first step was honoring what my grandparents had always valued most: education. With their journals and old conversations as my compass, I established the Elizabeth and Harold Alexander Foundation for Education. We launched with an initial $10 million endowment focused on scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for arts programs, and vocational training. The causes were random. They were the very things my grandparents used to talk about during Sunday dinners. "Kids need skills, Natalie," Grandpa would say. "Not just diplomas, skills that give them a future." The first scholarship recipients were announced that spring. 20 high school seniors, all from families who had been told college was out of reach, suddenly had their futures secured. Watching them accept their awards, tears in their eyes, I felt closer to my grandparents than I had since their funeral. Their legacy wasn't just money in a bank, it was hope planted in the lives of others. Meanwhile, I returned to my kindergarten classroom. Many people assumed I'd quit teaching once I inherited millions, but I didn't. Teaching wasn't just a job, it was my calling. What changed was my ability to transform the environment my students learned in. New books lined the shelves, art supplies filled the cabinets, every child had healthy snacks and warm winter coats. I even paid for a small classroom library corner with beanbags and tablets so my students could practice reading in comfort. It wasn't about spending money. It was about creating a world where children could thrive. Back at Alexander Logistics, Rosa took me under her wing. Though I never intended to run the company myself, I wanted to honor my grandparents by protecting what they had built. I sat in on board meetings, listened to employee concerns, and made sure the profit-sharing program they had created continued. For the first time, I understood the deeper meaning behind their success. It wasn't about expanding endlessly or dominating competitors, it was about loyalty, fairness, and stability for the 100-plus families who relied on the company. Slowly, the emptiness of my grandparents' house faded. With Carlos's help, I renovated the basement into a community space for foundation meetings and tutoring programs. Dorothy continued to come by 3 times a week, insisting she would never retire fully. This house, "He still needs me," she would say, bustling through the kitchen with her apron dusted in flour. And then there were the Sunday dinners. At first, sitting at that table without my grandparents felt unbearable. But gradually, I began inviting the people they had trusted, Matthew, Rosa, Carlos and his family, Dorothy, neighbors who had been part of our lives for decades. The dinners grew into something new. We laughed, shared stories, and celebrated milestones together. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the family I had been given. A chosen family bound not by blood, but by love and loyalty. My biological family, of course, tried to creep back into my life. My father called during a rough patch in his company's finances, dangling the idea of a short-term loan that would be a win-win for everyone. My mother reached out when her social circle started whispering about the foundation, suddenly expressing interest in serving on the board. Jason texted after his latest venture collapsed, begging for seed money. Aunt Pam called around Thanksgiving, suggesting that families should be together for the holidays, especially in a house big enough to host. Each time, I responded the same way, politely but firmly. If you want a relationship, it must be built on respect and genuine care, not money. None of them could meet that condition, and slowly their attempts became less frequent. It was painful, of course. Every call and message reminded me of what I had lost, but it also reaffirmed what I had gained: clarity, boundaries, and freedom. My grandparents hadn't left me defenseless. They had prepared me for this exact test. One crisp autumn morning, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since the funeral. Standing by their graves, I placed fresh flowers and whispered the words I'd been carrying for months. Thank you for trusting me, for preparing me, for owing me what money should be used for. I promise I'll carry it forward. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment I could almost feel their presence, calm, steady, proud. Walking back to my car, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving without them. I was building on the foundation they had laid. And though I still carried grief, it was softened by purpose. I had been given millions, yes, but more importantly, I had been given a mission. And with every child helped, every scholarship granted, every dinner filled with laughter, I was proving my grandparents right. Money was never the goal. Legacy was. 6 months after the confrontation, after the threats had quieted and the legal dust had settled, I returned to my grandparents' graves for the first time since the funeral. The autumn air was crisp, the trees painted in shades of gold and amber, and I carried a bouquet of fresh flowers. Sunflowers, my grandmother's favorite. For weeks, I had avoided this moment. The pain had felt too raw, the silence of the cemetery too heavy. But now, I was ready. I knelt down by their headstones, brushing away fallen leaves, and let the words spill out. I'm trying my best to honor what you built, I whispered. The foundation has already helped students who never thought college was possible. The company is thriving, and your employees still talk about you with respect. I'm still teaching, still doing the work you told me mattered. I think you'd be proud. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't the same tears I had cried in the weeks after their deaths. These were softer, filled with gratitude rather than despair. As I sat there, memories washed over me. Grandpa teaching me to fish, Grandma guiding my hands as I kneaded dough, both of them clapping at every school play and soccer game my parents had skipped. Those memories weren't about money. They were about presence, about love, about values that no fortune could buy. For so long, I had believed the inheritance was about numbers, 26 million in assets, investments, propers. But sitting there, I understood what my grandparents had known all along. The true inheritance was never the money. It was the lessons, the values, the example they set. They had shown me that wealth without compassion is emptiness. That family without respect is nothing more than strangers bound by DNA. That legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the principles you leave behind. As the wind rustled through the trees, I felt a strange peace. My parents, my brother, my aunt, they had all revealed their true colors. And while it hurt to lose them, I realized I hadn't truly lost anything. What I gained was clarity, a chosen family who stood by me, a community that loved me, and the strength to live on my own terms. Later that week, I hosted the Foundation's first major event, a scholarship ceremony for 20 high school seniors. Watching those students step on stage, tears of joy in their eyes, I saw my grandparents' legacy living on in each of them. One girl, Maria, hugged me afterward, saying, "No one in my family has ever gone to college. This changes everything, not just for me, but for my little brothers and sisters. They believe it's possible now." That moment hit me harder than any dollar amount ever could. This was what my grandparents had wanted. This was the ripple effect they had been building for decades, and now it was my turn to carry it forward. The money had revealed my parents' greed, yes, but it had also revealed something else, my own capacity to lead, to give, to honor the people who raised me. That was the true inheritance, not a fortune in the bank, but a calling written into my heart. So, when people ask me what it feels like to inherit 26 million, my answer is simple. It feels heavy, but not for the reasons you think. The money itself doesn't define me. What defines me is the responsibility that comes with it. The responsibility to use it for good, to keep alive the values of two people who built everything not for themselves, but for others. If you've made it this far, maybe you've felt echoes of this in your own life. Maybe you've faced family who valued wealth or appearances more than love. Maybe you've had to choose between standing your ground and giving in to pressure. If so, I want you to know you are not alone. Family is not about obligation or advantage, it's about respect, love, and shared values. That is the lesson my grandparents left me. That is the inheritance I carry forward, and it's worth more than all the millions in the world.